Alright, hello everyone and welcome back to episode number 2 of the How to Program with Java podcast. Again, I am Trevor Page and I'll be your host for this show. Hopefully you've all listened to my first episode where I talk about what this podcast will be all about. One thing I want to make sure that my podcast does that's a little bit different from the other podcasts is I want to try to cut down as best as I can on all of the, what I like to call fluff content, okay? These are, in other podcasts, I notice people like to talk about their day and to talk about their weekend and talk about, and that's great. You can really connect with the actual host that way. You can, relate with them perhaps, but I find that this really gets in the way when I just want to, pick up an episode and I want to learn. I want to go to the gym and I want to listen and I want to learn, or I want to just drive in my car and listen and learn. So I'm going to try to cut down as best as I can on all of that, what I call fluff stuff, and just deliver you content that you will like and that you will find useful, okay? So, having said that, in today's episode number 2, I want to start talking about some of the fundamental concepts that are common amongst all programming languages, or maybe not all, but at least a large portion of them, okay? That will be my first probably 4 or 5 episodes. We'll be talking about, one piece of each of these fundamental concepts across all programming languages, okay? But first, I want to talk a little bit about Java, and I want to talk about the fact that it's an object-oriented programming language, okay? Not all programming languages are object-oriented, but Java is one of them that is object-oriented. All right, so what in the heck is an object-oriented programming language, you might ask? Well, it's a good question. Object-oriented languages, and there's many, Java is just one of them, object-oriented languages share the commonality of programming to objects. So everything in these programming languages revolves around objects. And when I say objects, what do I mean? Well, I'm saying this is a concept based on real-world objects. So what is an object? A chair, a desk, a lamp, a person, a user. If you were to describe a sentence that would describe some functionality of a program, like let's say you're given a requirement to build some sort of website that allows you to log in or create a username and log in, right? So your requirement is, I want you to create me a website that will allow me to, log in with a username and password and bring me to my home page, okay? So you would dissect that sentence and pull out all of the nouns from that sentence. And what is a noun? Well, a noun is a person, place, or thing, okay? And by thing, you could even say object, but that might be a bit misleading. So when you look at that sentence, you have a requirement to build a web page, that blah, blah, blah. So, okay, maybe web page could be a noun, but that's kind of maybe a high level, that's too broad of an object in this case. What other objects might we extract from that sentence? Well, first of all, logging in, I suppose that's more of a verb, but a user logs in, and a user has a password. Okay, so those are 2 aspects of that sentence that we could pull out and perhaps make into objects. Okay, so we could create an actual object in our programming language that would represent a user or a password. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say object-oriented. So it just tries to take code, programming code, and make it more human. Make it more, I suppose, readable. So someone who knows nothing about programming can look at your screen full of all of this random code, and they can say, hey, what? I see this thing called a user. I think I know what a user is. Or I see this thing called desk. Or I see this thing called, whatever. And And I can relate to that because I know what that is in the real world. It's just an object, right? So this is a very important concept inside of Java. Objects, okay? So there you go. Object-oriented programming in a few minutes. So this is obviously a very simplistic explanation of what object-oriented programming is. Object-oriented programming language is. But we're going to talk about this subject a lot across all of these tutorials. So if you don't quite get it yet, don't worry. I'm sure over time, over the next few tutorials at least, you'll get it. Don't worry. So one little thing that I want to get out right now so that no one is confused by this is the fact that Java as a language, a programming language, is different from JavaScript as a programming language. Okay, that's a common misconception that Java and JavaScript are the same thing. And what I'll touch on later is something called typing, a weakly typed and a strongly typed language. Okay, when you hear me talk about that later, you'll understand what I mean. But Java is a strongly typed language, and JavaScript is a weakly typed language. So I just want to say that and get that out of the way right now. So, having said that, let's talk about something that's more fundamental across any programming language. So not just an object-oriented programming language like Java, but a fundamental concept across any programming language, okay? And this is called a variable. So you may have heard this term before, variable, but what does it mean with respect to programming languages? Okay? Well, I can jump over to Wiki and type in variable for computer science or something, or computer programming, and it would spit out a sentence that says, in computer programming, a variable is a storage location and an associated symbolic name which contains some known or unknown quantity or information. Okay? So that's fairly cryptic. Whenever you look up these kinds of definitions, they always try to be as, I suppose, correct as possible. So I'm going to try to make it a little more understandable for, the layman. So what does this really mean? Well, a variable, to me, is something that just stores information for later use. Okay? So it stores information that you can later look up and retrieve. Fair enough? So let's talk about an example. So I'd like to talk about usernames and passwords. So if I were to create a variable called user, how could I store information into this in such a way that I could reference it later? Well, believe it or not, a user has a password, right? And a user could also have a username. So these are two sort of properties that the object user could have. Username, password. Okay? So username and password could be perceived as variables because they could vary in what they actually contain from user to user to user to user. Okay? Your username may be John Doe 57, and my username could be T Page 45, for example. Everyone has a unique username. Everyone has a different username. So if I were to use this concept of a variable and I give it a name, because the whole point of this is I want to reference that variable. I want to say, hey, variable, what do you have right now? What's inside of you right now? What are you pointing to? All right? Then I need to actually reference that variable in some way, so I give it a meaningful name. So for the case of username and password, well, what better name to give the variable than username and password? Does that make sense? So I think that is pretty straightforward, okay? So if we have a variable called username and a variable called password, what does that mean in terms of programming, any programming language, right? Well, there's usually a syntax that goes around creating the variable. Okay, you need to type in some specific code in such a way that you're instructing the computer that you want to be storing a certain type of information inside of this variable name. So I want to be storing usernames in the username variable, and I want to be storing passwords in the password variable. So this is where another topic comes up, and it's related to variables, and it's known as types. Variable types. And this is a very important concept in programming, okay? And it's sort of, we have to bridge two gaps here, because some programming languages are what's known as strongly typed, and other programming languages are known as, I believe it's weakly typed, okay? So strong and weak. Strong type, weak type. So let me talk about that just a little bit. I don't want to go too deep into that, but a strongly typed language means that when you create a variable, you need to specify what type that variable will be. Okay, that's a strongly typed language. You need to specify what type that variable will be. If you're talking about a weakly typed programming language, then you don't necessarily have to do that. You don't have to give it a type. You can just say, hey, this is a variable, and I'm going to be storing something inside of it, but I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to be storing inside of it because you're weakly typed, so you don't care. Okay? With our more specific topic, subject of Java, Java is a strongly typed language. Okay? So, having said that, Java is a strongly typed language, so that means that Java cares about what type you give to the variables. Okay? So let's talk about, again, username and password. How does type fit in to username and variable, username and password? Well, what would you normally want to store in a username? So some questions that you'd have to ask yourself when determining the variable's type is what am I going to be storing in it? Am I going to be storing numbers? Am I going to be storing letters? Am I going to be storing numbers and letters? Or perhaps more specifically, am I going to be storing very, very, very large numbers? Like, let's say, on the order of trillions, okay? Or am I going to be storing really small numbers? Am I going to be storing numbers that require decimal places? Am I going to have to be very, very precise with the number that I'm storing, down to, 20 decimal places? Okay? These are all the questions that you need to ask yourself, and the reason why you need to ask yourself this is because the programming language that you use, not even just Java, but any programming language, usually has some sort of mechanism that allows you, or that allows the handling of the values in certain ways. And that the values means the values that you are storing inside of the variable. Okay? So if you're just storing letters, then you're not going to have to be concerned about rounding the username up or down based on what the decimal is inside the username, right? That doesn't make any sense. There's no numbers in the username, so why would I care about rounding up or down, right? So, but if I had a number, and the number had 20 decimal places, and I wanted to be able to round to the third decimal place, then I would have to use one particular type of variable over another. Does that seem to make sense to you guys? So let me give you some actual examples in Java, okay? So if I'm storing a username, let's say for the sake of argument that a username is just letters, okay? uppercase, lowercase letters. No numbers, no special symbols, no... Well, I guess you could have symbols if you want, but let's just say no numbers, okay? There is a variable type in Java called string, okay? String, S-T-R-I-N-G. And this variable type allows you to store letters. Just any letters you want. A full sentence, it can have spaces. You know what? It could even have numbers, so I guess this isn't the greatest example. But the point of it is that it stores letters for the most part. Sentences or whatever you like. And that would be perfect for a username, because the username is just going to be letters. And fine, let's say the username can have a number at the end, because I did use that earlier with an example of Joe or John Doe and Trevor Page. So let's say, for the sake of argument, our username can have numbers. But string, the variable type string, still works perfectly for that. And so what is the variable type string? So it allows you to be able to play around with the value inside of that variable. Okay? So if the value that I assign to a string, my username, is tpage or Trevor Page, then I have the ability, because it's a string, because it's of type string, I have the ability to do things like make all the letters uppercase, make all the letters lowercase. I can remove certain letters from my string. I could replace certain letters. So if I wanted to take all the T's and make them R's, I could do that if I like, because it's a variable type string. Okay? Now, I won't get into all the nitty-gritty details of what you can do to a string variable type, because that's probably a whole nother episode all on its own, and I'm sure I will talk about that, but I want to keep it as simple as I can for you guys, because you're just starting to learn. So let's talk about just a number, okay? So if I have a certain way to describe letters and letters with numbers as a string variable type, what's the variable type that I can use to define a number? Okay, so let's say, for example, we want to store a number like a birthday, okay? A birthday is a great example because it is a whole number, okay? Usually when you say how old you are, you don't say I'm 20.5 years old or 19.3 years old, okay? You say I'm 19 or I'm 20 or I'm 25. Those are whole numbers, okay? And in Java, you can use the variable type called integer to define this variable, okay? So if you had a variable name, we need to give it a name, okay? Let's say that the name is age, okay? Age meaning how old you are. So we have a variable that we've called age, and the type of our age variable will be integer, okay? Because we know, going into this, that we're only going to need to store whole numbers. We don't need to store decimal places. So if we define it as an integer, then that means that automatically, out of the box, we can ensure that our number will always be a whole number. So for example, if you're asking, let's say we have a web page, okay? And on this web page, we have a username and password. Sure, the person can log in. Great. They log in, and let's say they need to provide some details about themselves, perhaps for a profile, kind of like Facebook, okay? We need the user to tell us how old they are, what their age is, okay? And if we then say, okay, our variable name will be age, the variable type will be integer, then we are assured that if the user that is typing in their age, if they type in 20.5, then Java, the programming language, will complain. It'll say, hey, no, you're trying to put a decimal value into an integer variable type, and that's just not allowed. Okay? So we get this kind of validation out of the box. Okay, so that's kind of the usefulness that the integer variable type gives to us. So let's give another example of a number. Another variable that we will need to provide a decimal place. So what's a good example of that? Let's say we want to store, for some random reason, the number pi, 3.14. And maybe we want to get specific, 3.14, I don't know, 159. I don't know any more decimal places of pi myself, so that's a good example. So we could create a variable, again, to store this number, this pi number, but this time we can't use integer because it has decimal places, and that's not allowed for an integer. So what could we use? Well, we could use a string, like I said before. Again, a string is usually what you use to store readable sentences, but that's not exactly what a string is for, because like I said, the variable type that you give to your variable will kind of open doors to allow you to modify or mess around with your variable. So if, let's say, for the sake of argument, that we assign the pi variable to the type of string, and then try to store the number of pi, 3.14159, into our string, well, then we're kind of limiting ourselves with what we can do with that number. Like, let's say we want to add, or we want to multiply it by 2. We want to do pi times 2, pi by 2. If we have it declared as a string, we can't do that. Java does not understand one string multiplied by another string. It's going to give you an error when you type in your code. It's going to say, what the heck are you doing? You don't know what you're doing, clearly. So that's just, I'm trying to give you an example of what doesn't really work and how the code will handle it, okay? So what then makes sense? What variable type could we use for our pi variable? There's a variable type called double. Don't ask me why it's called double. I think it's actually called double in a few languages. I think it's also called float or something like that. Actually, now that I think about it, Java does have a float variable type. I'll have to look up what the difference is between double and float. But for now, double could be used as the variable type for our variable pi. Okay? So what does double do? Well, double allows you to store a value, a number, with decimal places. Okay? And I think it's up to somewhere around 16 decimal places in precision. Don't quote me on that, but I believe that's pretty much what it is. So that's what you could use. You could use a double, and you could store pi in there, 3.14159, blah, 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 blah. And it'll be completely happy with that. And then if you wanted to, you could multiply pi by itself. You could say pi equals pi times 2. And voila, you would have whatever that mathematical answer is inside of your variable pi. Now you're replacing whatever was in pi with what you've designated it to be, which is pi times 2. Okay, and so that's kind of the idea of variables and variable types. Okay, you can use variables to make your programs function in a way that's specific to whatever environment they're in. So a great example of this is, let's say, our Facebook example. So we have Facebook, we have a username and password, and a user can log in to their own profile page. Okay? Facebook, I don't think Facebook uses Java. It uses probably another programming language, maybe PHP or something, I don't know. But it allows a whole crap load of people to be able to type in their username, type in their password, say login. It will take the username, take the password, run it through their algorithm to see if they actually do exist as a user, and see if they do exist as a user, if that password matches what's in their database, I guess. And if it does match, then it allows them to log in, and then they see their customized profile page, and all of the people that they are subscribed to will see, all of those people in the results for your wall or whatever, your news feed. That's what drives this entire process, is variables, okay? Because variables can change. The values, I should say, the values inside the variables can change. And depending on what that value is, you might want to do something in particular instead of something else in particular, right? So when I log in, I use Trevor, Page, whatever. I use my password, and then given those two variables, I show you Trevor's profile page. I'm not going to show you John Doe's profile page because that's not what you typed into your variable, right? So hopefully you're shaking your head now and saying, "Oh my God, Trevor, stop talking. I understand. Hopefully you are saying that, and if you are, that's great, because that means you understand this, and I've drilled it into your head enough. So let's see, I've been talking for about 25 minutes now, good. So I think that's a good, solid understanding of what a variable is, and let me just go back to my notes and make sure that there's nothing else that I need to talk about. I don't think there is. So I'll wrap up for this episode. And as always, I urge you to go to my website, which is howtoprogramwithjava.com. And on there is a whole wealth of information about Java programming. You'll even see my very first written tutorial is all about a variable. So either you can go there if you like, or you can go to my show notes for this particular episode, and that will be available at howtoprogramwithjava.com/session2. Okay, session 2. And that's the number 2, not spelled out. And there you'll see maybe an overview of what it was that we talked about, and I'll provide a link perhaps back to that written blog post that I have that teaches you about what a variable is in case there's anything you wanted to brush up on. You can go ahead and do that. So, thank you very much for listening, and if you can also do me one big favor, if you can go and log into whatever iTunes and give this show a rating, okay, that would be great. It helps to get these shows found in the iTunes store or whatever store, and really gets the word out so that more people can listen and learn how to become a programmer. I think that'd be really great. If you feel that, so far from the stuff that you've listened to, you think it's a 5-star, then by all means give me a 5-star. That'd be great. If you do, I'll try to mention you in my next show to say, hey, thank you very much, so-and-so, for doing that. I'll give you some props on the podcast. If you don't believe that we deserve a 5-star, then whatever you think we deserve, that would be great. I would love to hear your feedback. I love it. I thrive on it, and I encourage it. Okay? So thank you very much again for listening, everybody, and have yourselves a great day. Bye for now.